For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For many, death is a sorrowful event. For Padre Pio, it was like a release from prison or a long-awaited journey home. His life was completely oriented toward attaining heaven. What if I told you that he had a shocking vision right before his death? Yes, just before the moment Pio was called to our God, he exclaimed things that left everyone present there astonished. The vision, right before his death. In 1968, Padre Pio's health deteriorated condition. A few days before his death, although weak and extremely ill, he insisted on hearing confessions. He desired to die on his feet, at his place of work, after a day spent with others in prayer and in his ministry for good. He seemed always at the extreme limits of his strength, and he was in constant expectation of death. When saying goodnight, Padre Pio often asked his Capuchin brothers to recommend him to the Lord because he was not sure if he would be alive in the morning. Padre Pio was not frightened of death, but he felt it looking over his shoulder, ready to snatch him away. Several months before his death, Padre Pio asked that a picture of Saint Joseph be hung near his cell. His confreres noticed that he would stop every day before the picture and gaze at it in silence. It was only later that they learned that Padre Pio had been praying each day to Saint Joseph for a happy death. Some of the Capuchins also stated that for a number of weeks before Padre Pio's death, the monastery of Our Lady of Grace seemed to have an altogether different feeling about it. The corridors, the rooms and gathering areas, and the monastery itself seemed to be pervaded by what was described as a mystical silence. At that time, no one knew that Padre Pio would soon be passing away. When Padre Pio knew that his end was approaching, he immersed himself in prayer. Pio's life was dedicated to prayer, from the solitary prayers he learned as a child in Pietrelcina, to the Our Father which he prayed in his cell during the last hours of his life, when he was perfectly conscious of his imminent departure. In his temptations he prayed, in his joys he prayed, in the many vicissitudes of life he prayed, in his illness he prayed. God imbued his whole existence and his every action with prayer. In a sense, Padre Pio had always looked forward to the end of his earthly pilgrimage. He longed to return to his true home, heaven, where he could be united to God for eternity. He wrote a letter to Padre Agostino and said, "Living here below is wearisome to me, my dear Father. It is such a bitter torment to me to live in exile that I can hardly go on any longer. The thought that at any moment I could lose Jesus terrifies me in a way I cannot explain." Not long before Padre Pio passed away, he spoke to his superiors and asked them to pray for him. Pio confessed, "When my time comes to leave this life, if my Heavenly Mother is not there to hold my hand, how will I have courage?" Soon after midnight on the 23rd, he made his final confession and renewed his Franciscan vows. He was so weak he could barely speak, but was able to repeat the words, "Jesus Mary," while clutching a rosary. Then, suddenly, around 2:30 a.m., he perked up a bit. The saint, who had had so many supernatural experiences throughout his life, appeared as though he was seeing something, though no one around him saw anything special. He managed to say, "I see two mothers," whispered, "Maria," then died. Regarding the two mothers, there are only a few possibilities. He could have meant he was seeing his spiritual mother Mary, Mother of God, and his biological mother. The Church is also a mother, though it's not clear how that could be manifested. And while it might seem obvious that his last word, Maria, referred to the Blessed Virgin, his biological mother was also named Maria, so he may have been referring to her. Either way, it seems fitting that a man whose life was full of supernatural happenings would finish his earthly life with a mystical vision. During the months that preceded his death, Padre Pio's stigmata had been slowly disappearing, beginning with the wounds on his feet. The Capuchins who attended him noticed that his wounds were bleeding less and less. The bandages that had to be changed regularly were significantly less blood-stained. On September 22, 1968, the day before Padre Pio's death, his left palm still had a raised scab. During the Mass that morning, 2 scales fell from his hand. When doctors examined Padre Pio's body after his death, they discovered that the stigmata on his hands, feet, and side had disappeared completely. His skin was now smooth and regenerated in the places where the wounds had once been. There was no scarring whatsoever. The skin looked as fresh as that of a newborn baby. The doctor noticed the beautiful fragrance of orange blossoms in the room. He had perceived the fragrance on many occasions when in the presence of Padre Pio. As they stood together and looked at Padre Pio's lifeless body, a scab detached and fell from his left hand. It was the very last sign of the wounds of Christ which he had carried on his body for 50 years. Padre Pio looked beautiful and serene in death. A rosary was placed in his hands as well as a crucifix and the rule of St. Francis. Around his shoulders was draped his priestly purple stole. Air Force and police helicopters flew overhead, dropping flowers and prayer cards on the huge crowd below. It is estimated that 100,000 people attended Padre Pio's funeral mass. His body was placed in a granite crypt and buried directly below the main altar of the church. "I will be able to help you more from heaven than I can on earth," Padre Pio often said to those who sought his counsel. And it is from heaven that he has been helping so many of his spiritual children from every part of the world. The very last moment. Padre Pio was extremely weak on September 22nd. On that day, the church was full to overflowing. The members of Padre Pio's worldwide prayer groups were present at the Mass that morning. They had come to San Giovanni Rotondo to attend the International Prayer Group Congress. Padre Pio said Mass on that day in thanksgiving for the prayer groups and in special thanksgiving for the official approval and recognition they had recently received from the Holy Office in Rome. It was a great joy for Padre Pio to know that his prayer groups were established on a firm foundation and were flourishing worldwide. As he left the altar, he almost collapsed. Several of the Capuchins who assisted at the Mass aided him and kept him from falling. Padre Pio looked out at the sea of people, and in a broken and shaky voice called out, "My children, my children." Later, he went to a window of the monastery to greet and bless the prayer group members who were gathered in the piazza below. He was so weak that he had to be supported by 2 of his brothers, Capuchins. That evening, about 9:20 p.m., Padre Pio used the intercom to call Padre Pellegrino to come to his room. Padre Pellegrino, who took turns with Padre Onorato and Padre Mariano in assisting Padre Pio, was assigned to the evening duty that night. When Padre Pellegrino answered Padre Pio's call and entered his room, he found him in bed and noticed that his eyes were red with tears. Padre Pio had called him because he wanted to know what time it was. Padre Pellegrino dried Padre Pio's tears with a handkerchief and told him the time. After he checked to make sure that Padre Pio was all right, he went back to his room. In his dying moments, Padre Pio said, "If the Lord calls me today, ask the brothers to forgive me for all the trouble I have been to them, and ask them and all my spiritual children to pray for my soul." Padre Pio then said that he wanted to renew his religious vows. Padre Pio renewed his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. He said, "I, Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, vow and promise to Almighty God, to the Blessed Virgin Mary, to our Holy Father, St. Francis, to all the saints, and to you, Father, to observe all the days of my life the rule of the Friars Minor, confirmed by Pope Honorius, and to live in obedience, without property, and in chastity." Padre Pio had severe arthritis, and at 81 years of age, his posture was stooped and bent. Because it was very painful for him to walk, he used a wheelchair most of the time. But on this night, for some reason, He was able to stand up straight, and he walked briskly and with great ease to the veranda, needing no assistance. When Padre Pio got to the veranda, he reached over and turned on the light. That was something he had not done in so long. Padre Pio then began to stare intently at a particular area on the veranda. He was staring at the exact place where the Capuchins would carry his lifeless body in just a few short hours. Suddenly, Padre Pio began to feel very ill. He wanted to go back to his room, but he was too weak to stand up. All of the color had drained out of Padre Pio's face, and he was growing weaker by the minute. He began to repeat the words, "Jesus, Mary," over and over. All the while, his voice was growing fainter. Then, Padre Pio began to stare intently at a picture that was hanging on the wall. He wanted to know who it was. A father there answered, "Those are photographs of your mother and father." "But I see two mothers," Padre Pio said. Right after Padre Pio spoke of seeing two mothers, he seemed to grow weaker. He broke out into a cold sweat, and his lips began to turn blue. The doctor arrived in less than 10 minutes and realized that Padre Pio was having a severe bronchial asthma attack. He gave him an injection, as well as oxygen, in an attempt to ease his breathing, which had become difficult and labored. While the doctors were doing their very best to help Padre Pio, the Capuchins knelt down beside him and prayed the Our Father, the Hail Mary. Together, the Capuchins repeated, "Jesus, Mary and Joseph, I give you my heart and my soul. Jesus, Mary and Joseph, assist me in my last agony. Jesus, Mary and Joseph, may my soul peacefully expire in you." The holy oils were prepared, and Father Paolo gave Padre Pio the last rites. Padre Pio was fully conscious and was very much aware of all that was happening. His feet and hands were becoming very cold, and he was perspiring heavily. When the doctors realized that he was having a heart attack, he was given an injection directly into his heart. With his eyes closed, he continued to repeat the words, "Jesus, Mary." Toward the end, his lips formed the words, but he could make no sound, not even a whisper. The Capuchins called out to him, "Padre, Padre." He opened his eyes one last time and looked at his dear brothers. At 2:30 a.m. on September 23, 1968, with his rosary clasped in his hands, Padre Pio gently bowed his head and died. The last Holy Mass. 2 days before his death, on September 20th, 1968, it also was the 50th anniversary of Padre Pio's stigmata. For Padre Pio, it would be a day like any other day, a day devoted to Mass, prayer, and service to the Lord. But it was not a day like any other day for his spiritual children from around the world. Many had come great distances to be present for his anniversary. The Mass on September 20th was at the usual early morning hour of 5 a.m., and the church was filled to capacity. Many people had to stand outside during the Mass. In keeping with Padre Pio's wishes, there were no speeches, no festivities, no celebration. There was only one exception to the rule, and that was the hundreds of deep red roses that decorated the sanctuary of the church. The crucifix in the choir loft, before which Padre Pio received the stigmata on September 20th, 1918, was also adorned with beautiful red roses. Everyone at the Mass was touched by the humility, the sincerity, and the great faith of this man of prayer. He literally lived the Mass. He relived the Passion of Christ. From the expression on his face, he actually suffered with Christ. His eyes sometimes would close, his face would contort in pain, and his lips would tremble. Frequently, people saw him wipe tears from his eyes with his handkerchief. He was seated for the Mass and faced the people. In obedience to his superiors, the Mass lasted only a good half hour. A day later, he died. The news of Padre Pio's death spread quickly. No one had anticipated it, or had any reason to expect that he would die on September 23rd. The world was shocked and in mourning. In his hometown of Pietrelcina, the bells of the parish church tolled every half hour. Many who had come to attend Padre Pio's 50th anniversary Mass, as well as the International Prayer Group Congress, were present at his funeral. It was as if divine providence had arranged for Padre Pio's spiritual children from all parts of the world to be nearby at the time of his passing. The one who knows his death and his last miracle. There were many indications that Padre Pio had knowledge of the time and date of his death. To his niece, Pia Forgione Pinelli, he said in 1966, "I will not be alive in 2 years." It means that he would die in 1968. He told his friend Pietruccio Cugino that he would die in his 81st year, and indeed he did. Padre Pio was very close to Father Onorato Marcucci, who assisted him in the last 3 years of his life. When Father Onorato had to travel to Montecatini a short time before Padre Pio's passing, Padre Pio said to him, "Son, I beg you to return as soon as possible." This means he wanted to have those he loved near him at the time of his death. Padre Pio told his spiritual daughter, Josephine Bove, that he would die when the crypt in the Church of Our Lady of Grace was built. He knew that the Capuchins were planning to build a crypt for his burial. Nevertheless, he indicated that it was not his desire to be buried in a specially made crypt. Rather, he wanted to be buried in a simple grave. The construction of the new Church of Our Lady of Grace was finished in 1959. Josephine Bove was afraid that the completion of the new church might in some way be a signal of Padre Pio's death. But the building of Padre Pio's crypt was put on hold for a number of years. Padre Pio died 16 hours later. There is an even more surprising story than that. A woman who lived in Catania, Sicily, visited San Giovanni Rotondo on September 8, 1968, and made her confession for a favor. She said that she had a great desire to see Padre Pio, even if only for a moment, and to kiss his hand. But at that moment, her wish seems incredibly far-fetched. There were too many pilgrims in the church that day. Father Pio was very busy. The woman explained that she had made the long journey to San Giovanni Rotondo from Sicily. She was poor and had made great sacrifices to get to the monastery. She did not have enough money to stay overnight in a hotel, but would have to return to Sicily that very day. All of her life, she had wanted to see Padre Pio, but could never afford to make the trip. A few days before, she had a vivid dream. In her dream, Padre Pio said to her, "If you want to see me, come to San Giovanni Rotondo immediately, because in a few days I will die." She had to borrow the money for the travel expenses. Not many people believe this story. They all think that this woman is making it up just to meet Padre Pio. But because this woman kept crying, a priest there felt compassion and decided to take her to meet Padre Pio. The woman knelt down and waited. When Padre Pio passed by the area where she was kneeling, he stopped. He looked at her with great tenderness and spoke to her. She was deeply moved when he placed his hands on her head, giving her a blessing. With tears in her eyes, she thanked him with all her heart for arranging the meeting. It was just 15 days later that Padre Pio passed away. A man named Gino Pin and his family also came to attend the 50th anniversary Mass of Padre Pio's Stigmata. Gino had a great devotion to Padre Pio and was a tireless worker for the Padre Pio prayer groups in Biella, Italy. After the meeting with Pio, Gino came back to the monastery to see Father Alberto. He was crying as he told Father Alberto that his daughter, Maria Pia, had just been admitted to the hospital and was in very serious condition. The doctors suspected that she had a tumor or possibly peritonitis. The next morning, Maria Pia's condition was even more desperate. Gino wondered if he should take her back home to Biella to receive medical treatment there. He asked Father Alberto to explain the situation to Padre Pio and ask for his advice. Father Alberto then recounted Gino's daughter, Maria Pia's serious condition to Padre Pio. Gino needs Pio's advice. He wonders if he should take her back home to Biella. What should he do? Padre Pio replied, "She should not be moved from the hospital. If she needs an operation, she should be operated on here and not in Biella." Padre Pio said, that he would pray for a cure from the Blessed Virgin for Maria Pia, so that she wouldn't have to have an operation. Several hours later, when a doctor examined Maria Pia, he found that she was completely well. She was immediately discharged from the hospital. The miraculous recovery of Gino Pin's daughter occurred on September 22nd, one day before Padre Pio's death. It is considered to be possibly the last miracle, the last grace invoked by Padre Pio to the Blessed Virgin before he died. Marisa Liberati, a spiritual daughter of Padre Pio, used to travel from Rome to San Giovanni Rotondo twice a month to make her confession to Padre Pio. She told him that she would like to bring her two nieces, Lucia and Anna, to the monastery to receive their first Holy Communion from his hands. Padre Pio told her to have the girls receive their religious instruction in Rome, and when it was completed, he would be happy to give them their first communion. Lucia and Anna attended catechism classes and completed their sacramental preparation, but their parents kept delaying the date for the trip to San Giovanni Rotondo. Marisa frequently spoke to Padre Pio about the situation. Toward the middle of September 1968, Marisa had a vivid dream. In her dream, Padre Pio told her to bring Anna and Lucia to San Giovanni Rotondo as soon as possible. There was an urgency in his words. When she woke up, she reflected on the dream and decided to cancel the pilgrimage that she was planning to make to Lourdes. Instead, she purchased the first Holy Communion clothing for her nieces, and along with their mother, took the girls to San Giovanni Rotondo. Padre Pio was extremely weak and ill on the day that Marisa arrived with her nieces. It was September 22nd, and the church was full to overflowing. The members of Padre Pio's worldwide prayer groups were present at the Mass that morning. At the Mass, Padre Pio gave communion first to Lucia and then to Anna. Anna Fanoni was the last person to receive Holy Communion from Padre Pio's hands, for he died the very next day. Padre Pio's words of faith. Throughout his life, Padre Pio always lived with complete faith in God. Despite facing trials of faith, he remained steadfast in his soul until death. In all the events of life, you must recognize the divine will, adore and bless it, especially in the things which are the hardest for you. Remember that God is within us when we are in a state of grace and outside of us when we are in a state of sin. But his angel never abandons us. He is our most sincere and faithful friend, even when we sadden him with our bad behavior. Prayer is the best weapon we possess. It is the key that opens the heart of God. You must always humble yourself lovingly before God and before men, because God speaks only to those who are truly humble, and he enriches them with his gifts. Humility and purity are the wings that carry us to God and make us almost divine. Let us always keep before our eyes the fact that here on earth we are on a battlefield, and that in paradise we shall receive the crown of victory. That this is a testing ground, and the prize will be awarded up above. That we are now in a land of exile, while our true homeland is heaven, to which we must continually aspire. And Jesus will assist you and give you the grace to live a heavenly life, and nothing whatever will be able to separate you from his love. The Mass is infinite, like Jesus. Ask an angel what the Mass is, and he will reply to you in truth. I understand what it is and why it is offered, but I do not, however, understand how much value it has. One angel, 1,000 angels, all of heaven know this and think like this. The heavenly child suffers and cries in the crib so as to make his suffering for us lovable, meritorious, and sought after. He lacked everything so that we might learn from him to renounce earthly goods. He was pleased with humble and poor adorers so that we might love poverty and prefer the company of the little and simple ones to those of the great of the world. With his birth, he indicated our mission, namely, to despise what the world loves and seeks. Why did Jesus Christ sacrifice himself to the point of death? Faith answers, to expiate for our sins. Why did he rise in such splendor? to show us the meaning of our redemption. In his death, we recall that we were dead because of sin. In his resurrection instead, we have a perfect example of our resurrection in grace. Since Jesus Christ rose immortal to a life of glory, we must say with St. Paul that we too must rise immortal in the life of grace, firmly resolved to never again subject our souls to spiritual death. Our imperfections will accompany us to the grave. We cannot walk without touching the ground. It is true that we must not lie on the ground nor turn our face to it. But neither should we attempt to fly, for in the ways of the Spirit we are like young birds that have not yet grown wings. In our thoughts and in confession, we must not dwell on sins that were previously confessed. Because of our contrition, Jesus forgave them at the tribunal of penitence. It was there that he faced us and our destitution, like a creditor standing before an insolvent debtor. With a gesture of infinite generosity, he tore up and destroyed the promissory notes which we signed with our sins, and which we would certainly not have been able to pay without the help of his divine clemency. Remember, our suffering is brief, but our reward is eternal. You must remain calm, or at least resigned, but always convinced in the voice of authority. You must confide in it without fearing the rages of the storm, because the vessel of your soul will never be submerged. Jesus will never abandon you. I ask you to pray hard for the efficacy of my ministry. I am afraid of displeasing the Lord in the exercise of my priestly activity. May Jesus arrange all things for his glory and our salvation. In heaven, everything will be spring as far as beauty is concerned, autumn as far as enjoyment is concerned, summer as far as love is concerned. There will be no winter, but here winter is necessary to exercise self-denial, and 1,000 other little but beautiful virtues which are exercised at times of sterility. Jesus, who is infinitely merciful, will not fail to give you now and then a respite from the trial he has sent you. He is so good that he will never allow you to give in. The trial is a very hard one, but the Lord, who is so very, very good, will not fail to lighten the cross from time to time.